So when the pan is hot enough, screaming hot, lots of smoke, the steak goes in, and the thing they all tell you is, do not touch that steak. You get to flip it once, just once. Once you get great browning on the first side, you flip it over. The crust it puts on a steak is fantastic. They look gorgeous.
Tip number 4. For me, it's all about the searing. Make sure you have an amazing sear on that steak. And don't turn it unless it's colored. Remember, no color, no flavor.
So how many times have you heard that statement? Leave your steak alone. Only flip it once. Don't touch it, or you run the risk of drying it out and ruining it. Well, here's why that's bullshit. Let's dive in. I'm going to show you why flipping your steak often has 2 big advantages that can give you sous vide-like results. We're going to cook up several different steaks, half of them only flipped once, and the other half flipped every 30 seconds, and then we're going to compare the two. Do a weight test before and after cooking and see if there's a difference in the taste. And I'll also explain the science behind each method and the pros and cons. But there's a caveat. A special situation where flipping your steak often can possibly cause some bad results, but I'll get to that later on in the video. And there's one more thing. If you found this video informative, helpful, or entertaining, please consider subscribing and joining our channel membership so we can continue making videos like this one. I would really appreciate it. So let's start off with the leave it alone and only flip it once approach. And it all kind of starts with the browning or Maillard reaction. The process of caramelization of proteins, their amino acids, and sugar. It's the reaction along with a controlled amount of actual charring that produces the deep flavors that we all desire in a great steak. The flip only once method argues that by allowing the longest amount of contact heat per side yields the best possibility of creating browning without allowing the surface of the meat to cool. Essentially, by flipping only once, you get a better sear. But there's a problem with this theory. Just because one side of the steak is on direct heat, it doesn't mean that the other side has completely stopped cooking. Heat flows from hot to cold. Essentially, flipping once doesn't completely stop the cooking process, and you do run the risk of cooking your steak unevenly. Often this is seen when a steak is sliced in a form of a gray band. So what about flipping your steak multiple times? This actually has 2 clear advantages. First, faster cooking times. Harold McKee, a food scientist, figured out that flipping frequently yields a 30% faster cooking result. The idea is that with repeated flips, each surface of the meat is exposed to heat relatively evenly, with very little time for it to cool down as it faces upwards. The faster you flip, the closer your setup comes to approximating a cooking device that sears your food on both sides simultaneously. Essentially, this method mimics 2-sided cooking, which means faster cooking and less time waiting before your steak hits the plate. The second advantage, as you probably already guessed, is more even cooking. And I think this is the true advantage to frequently flipping your steaks that makes the effort worth it. With the multiple flip technique, your meat comes out more evenly cooked from edge to edge with sous vide-like results when using the reverse sear method. But why? And how does this actually happen? By allowing each side to cool for a few moments after being heated for a few moments, the intense temperature gradients that cause buildup near the surface of the steak has time to dissipate. Some of the heat energy is released back into the air, while some of it is dissipated into the steak. In either case, it rescues the outer layer from cooking more than it absolutely needs to. Look at the results of both steaks. featured side by side here. On the left was a steak flipped only once, while on the right was a steak frequently flipped. Both steaks are medium rare, but the steak on the right is much more even throughout. And likewise, our taste testers, without a doubt, enjoyed both steaks very much, but agreed that the steak on the right was consistent and favored. Okay, I did want to go back to Lon's video where she clearly states that the conventional method of flipping a steak only once has some big disadvantages and why she prefers sous vide for a perfectly cooked steak. If you haven't already, go check out the full video because it's fantastic.
But even worse, if you cut into the steak, what you're going to see is a big ring of gray around a rosy center. As you're cooking the meat, you're pumping a ton of heat into the surface. And that heat will slowly work its way towards the center, cooking the steak, which is what we want. But because it takes so long to do that, you end up overcooking the edges, and that's why you get that gray band. Even professionals have a hard time with this method.
Weighing the steaks before and after proved to show virtually no difference. Flipping a steak only once doesn't give you a juicier steak, and likewise, frequently flipping a steak doesn't dry it out. Now, of course, there was some variation. Sometimes a steak by one method was 5 or 10% heavier than the other method, but they alternated and sort of canceled themselves out. And there's a lot of factors to that. The amount of oil that we put into the pan, maybe the cut of the steak wasn't perfect, and we were, of course, using bone-in ribeyes, and those bones can vary from steak to steak. So ultimately, at the end of the day, they were virtually identical, and one method wasn't juicier than the other. So what about that special case or the caveat I mentioned earlier to look out for? Some folks claim that by flipping a steak repeatedly, you end up reducing the amount of browning that occurs, thus reducing flavor. And this can be true, but only in certain and very easily avoidable cases. The main culprit of reducing browning is a lack of heat and an overabundance of moisture. That is, the surface moisture on a steak needs to evaporate before it can begin to brown. When you flip a steak multiple times, the surface being cooked will cool every time it faces upwards, countering the effects of browning. This is also mitigated by the fact that repeatedly flipping allows for efficiencies in the evaporation of the surface moisture. See, dryness alone is not sufficient to counter the effects of a cooling surface. Here's where you can get into trouble. When cooking relatively thin steaks with not so dry surfaces or not so hot skillets or grills, it's possible that your steak will begin to overcook in the center before it's actually had a chance to brown sufficiently on the surface. But there's a very simple solution to this potential problem. Just don't cook thin steaks, wet steaks, on cold grills or skillets. But let's face it, this is almost a non-issue provided you cook at the highest heat possible and your steak's at least an inch thick. And your steak should be at least an inch thick. And the surface of the meat has been dried out effectively. So if you have thinner steaks, crank up the heat and dry them. You'll find that your steak will brown faster than you likely want it to, requiring you to kind of reduce the heat to prevent them from over browning or charring and burning. So long story short, the next time someone tells you to leave your steak alone or only flip it once, educate them or call them out on their bullshit by showing them what they're missing out on. That's it for me, guys. I'll catch you on the next video. Take care, everybody.